Welcome to the fourth Realm of Roses Plotcast. At irregular intervals, we want to present important plot developments and recaps for you to listen to, from the perspective of the Realm of Roses, so that you can keep up to date, even if you can't or don't want to go to a convention. We also have some disclaimers, which we explained in detail in the first issue. Here's just a reminder. Disclaimer number 1. The summaries in the plotcast should not be taken as immutable truth. Number 2. The summaries of the plotcast are not neutral, but from the perspective of the Realm of Roses. And number 3. We do not deliberately tell lies or misinformation. Today's plotcast is something special because, for once, it doesn't summarize the events of an event. The JDS plotcast will take a while yet. Instead, today is about the trial of our new Archon Ramirez. As you know, this was only partly played at the Chronicling for various reasons, and then shared with some people as an out-of-game narrative, in order to be able to allude to the events at the JDS. The text has since been shared with everyone, thanks again to Laura for writing this story. But because this is of course an important event, we want as many people as possible to know about it. For those who don't like to read, this plotcast is essentially an audiobook of this story. And so, without further ado, time in. Trial of Thorns. The entrance. His people, his realm, his duty. The words pounded through him with each heartbeat. They echoed with the stamp of his horse's hooves on the ground. Ramirez lifted his head high, gazing towards that spot of darkness on the horizon, towards that place he had not been since Vincent had failed him and left him alone with this burden. Now he would pick up the work left behind. Now he would suffer and sacrifice to protect the realm, but not leave it to its fate. His thoughts kept returning to the Spirit of Thorns, the ethereal embodiment of the Realm of Roses, glimpsed in the veil of impermanence. The haunting vision she bestowed upon them remained, an imprint in his mind. The revelations of Caverns' machinations, utilizing the tormented souls to awaken Diregard as a realm of the undead. Vincent's death, his unwitting sacrifice, had served as the key to sealing off this malevolent force, safeguarding the realm from its threat. However, with the severed connection to a living will, the protective barrier teetered on the brink of dissolution. A sacrifice was necessary once more. Someone had to merge their will with that of the land, strengthening the very vines that shielded it, and reclaiming the power that fell with the scepter. The evil lurking beneath Diregard could only be subdued by a solitary figure, wielding the full might of the Thorns. No army, no battalion could stand against it, for they would only serve to fuel its insatiable hunger. Finally, they arrived upon the site, dread and determination battling inside him. Ramirez tugged at the reins, his beautiful cream-colored Caverns stallion halting in front of the teeming mass of thorny vines. They covered the ground, creating an impenetrable wall. They seemed to tremble, to slither like snakes, and unease crept up his spine. He turned the stallion around, watching the group gathered behind him. The friends, allies, and even family that had joined him in this trial of spirit, that were ready to sacrifice their life to protect the home that they loved, the people in it. Pride filled his chest as his eyes glided across their determined and even smiling faces. He opened his mouth to speak, to make a vow that was heavy with Caverns tradition, a sacred vow made from horseback to honor his roots. All of you have my gratitude for coming, and my apologies for asking this of you, this sacrifice. What we will face might seem like a place with no hope, but I vow to each and every one of you that it is not the end. It is the beginning of the future of the realm. The beginning of a cheer was cut off by the sharp elbow of the captain in red. This was not the time for loud outburst, but as one they nodded, and he smiled tightly back at them before sliding off his horse, his feet hitting the ground with the weight of an entire realm. Ramirez stood in solemn contemplation before the formidable barrier of thorns. Miro and Talakor, a few steps ahead of him, faces crunched with concentration and hands raised, magic twirling about their fingers. The vines writhed and twisted, the mage's assault relentless and unyielding. There was something like faint screaming in the air, like the vines were crying out in agony, but not giving in. Beads of sweat appeared on Miro's brow, as slowly, so slowly the vines pulled back, fighting for every inch they were forced to yield. Though as soon as they dared to catch their breath, they snapped forward, reclaiming the space. Ramirez took a step forward, then another, until he was standing in between Miro and Talakor, and the vines paused their retaliation, paused and then eased back as if his presence was allowed, maybe even expected. Side by side, they moved forward, Miro and Talakor's magic and his presence, cutting through the thorns until the group stood in the empty courtyard of a once beautiful castle. Ramirez turned to Miro, seeing the worry and the faint hope glimmering in the mage's eyes. "Thank you, friend," Ramirez said. Miro's voice was quiet when he spoke. "Take care, Ramirez, and return to us. We will not lose you as well." Ramirez bowed his head obediently, a wry smile tugging at his lips, before he turned on his heel and strode into the darkness. Kaela, Harold, and Denaya falling into step close behind him, as the rest of the group followed suit. Each step forward was a testament to their resolve, a testament to the unwavering determination to confront the might that threatened to engulf all they held dear, and they would not fail. A long way down. With Ramirez in front, Kaela, Harold, and Denaya close to him, and Maron, Aximand, and Lambert taking the rear, they moved down, climbing deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth. With each step into the labyrinthine depths, the air grew thick with the scent of dampness and decay until it felt like breathing in stagnant pond water. Initially, the catacombs appeared like any other, with vines clinging to the moss-covered walls, their tendrils weaving intricate patterns in the dim light. But as they pressed onward, the passageways gave way to a grand staircase, its steps descending into the yawning abyss below. With each spiraling turn, the darkness seemed to deepen, until at last they emerged into a vast chamber, a colossal well of death and despair. Crypts lined the walls, their stone surfaces weathered by time and neglect. But these crypts were not silent graves. They teemed with life of a macabre nature. Corpses, long since consigned to their eternal slumber, stirred with a dreadful animation, their limbs jerking as if yearning for release. Amidst the grim spectacle, poignant reminders of the lives once lived here lingered in the shadows. Huddled families frozen in time, their desperate embrace a sign of bonds not even death could sever. Nearby, the remains of civilians lay in silent repose, juxtaposed with the regal visage of nobles and their weathered countenance of soldiers, all united in their eternal imprisonment within Caverns' ancient domain. Here, in this chamber of forgotten souls, the passage of eons had rendered distinctions of rank and station meaningless, for in death all were equal in their silent suffering. A primal scream tore through the silence, reverberating with bone-chilling intensity. Umar's voice, raw with fear, pierced the stillness in response, echoing off the damp stone walls, and then turned into a whimper, as Ruvan slapped his hand over his mouth to quiet him. Harsh, frigid winds lashed against their faces, carrying with them the unmistakable stench of death. As if in response to the cacophony, The lights, fire and magic alike, fluttered and then died, plunging them into suffocating darkness. There was noise, clanking and growling from all around them. Ramirez pulled his sword and heard the sound of weapons from all around him, the song of blades, the whooshing of spears and the clicking of loading crossbows. Then the lights flickered once more, and the light returned somehow dulled and grey, lighting only a few feet in front of them, but it was enough to reveal the mass that writhed all around them. Corporeal remains of lives long extinguished moved with unnatural vigor. Ramirez grit his teeth, and his eyes met Kaela's. She nodded, nothing to do but fight. They could not outrun this horde. There was no time to get into formation, nothing to do but shout, "Get ready!" And then they were upon them. Ramirez moved on instinct, slicing, dodging and stabbing, Kaela and Harold at his side and arrows firing above his head and shoulders. Ramirez punching his sword through the mouth of the screaming corpse, and as it fell, it revealed another right behind, lunging for him. A foul curse fell from his lips as he battled to pull his sword free, and he had no time to move as another reached for him. Then Harold was in front of him, catching the rusty blade in his side. The sound of steel scraping against bone reverberated through Ramirez's very being as Harold intercepted the blade, the force of the blow driving it deep into his flesh, slicing through his ribs with a sickening crunch. Ramirez roared his defiance, pulling his own sword free and slicing the head clean of the assailant as Harold staggered back. "Keep moving," Kaela shouted, her blade flashing as she cleaved through the oncoming horde, clearing a path for their escape. Diop and Alanish, their faces contorted with concentration, pushed forward, a wall of magic rising between the group and the undead lunging for them. Ramirez caught Harold, gritting his teeth as the warm blood spilled over him, making the ground beneath them slippery. "I got him!" Kua's voice was breathless as he wrapped an arm under Harold, supporting him, and Ramirez could take up the lead again. "Forward!" he yelled, pushing harder now, desperate to get to a place of moderate safety. He pushed forward. Petrus arrived at his side to fill the gap that Harold left, and they finally pushed through an archway into a side corridor. Ramirez at the opening, watching the group rushing past him, Lambert, Maron and Eisermann slowly retreated, holding the back line. Their effort was a surprising show of harmony, where one swung, the other blocked, never leaving each other unguarded against the crawling, snarling, desperate creatures that were once alive. Only when they were almost to the archway did they turn sprinting into the darkness and safety. Then the vines closed over the opening, and they were left in silence. Only their panting, rasping breaths filled the space. Harold's cry of pain broke the silence as Aja's crystal dagger dived into his wound, water bubbling to the surface and the skin closing over. Ramirez moved swiftly to them. Harold was pale, sweat beading his forehead and his hand grasping over the new fresh skin. Aja slid her dagger into her belt, sitting back on her heels with a satisfied hum. "Just a scrape," Harold managed to get out, his breathing shallow. "I didn't lose anything vital." He grinned up at them. There was an edge to Ramirez's laughter. "Good thing you can't lose your sense of humor." Harold made a face, rubbing at his side. "You might be testing that theory, Ramirez." They gave themselves an hour to recuperate, Ramirez collecting in a distant corner with Kaela, Harold, and Talakor, Alanish, and Inaya to see if there was some plan to be made. Kua and Leander running as far ahead as they dared to scout. They could find no other plan but to continue, all sense of direction lost. So further down they went, the damp, cold, and darkness growing with each step. Going deeper and deeper, the darkness became almost like a fluid, only kept at bay by their dwindling supplies and the will of the mages. Everywhere in the darkness, the undead hid and lurked, waiting for an opportunity to attack. Sometimes it was just one, like the one that had crept up within the shadows, grabbing at Raoul's legs from behind a rocky outcrop. Only Lambert's quick thinking and swift movement of thought had the hands severed from the limbs and Raoul cursing foully as he kicked the body away from him. Sometimes it was a group, appearing out of a hidden side tunnel and splitting their group into two. They had fought their way back to each other with blades and magic. As the days passed, they stopped keeping score of their life debts. It was a continuous circle of being saved and doing the saving that seemed as never-ending as the horde of undead stalking them. It was the fourth day, or maybe the fifth, when the whispering, hissing sound turned into a voice, sweet and childlike, and ringing through his head like an anvil being struck, the birds lost in the echoes. Ramirez leaned against the cold, damp wall, moisture seeping through his clothes. He did not care anymore. They were all filthy, all exhausted. Cuts and bruises marred their faces, their healing saved for more grievous injuries. Dini threw a water skin to him, and he caught it in one hand, feeling the lightness of it keenly. He pulled the cork with his teeth, but the eyes caught on Raoul, his water skin dangling from his fingertips, as he stared off into the darkness, like he was listening to someone talking. Ramirez pushed off the wall, starting towards him. "What do you hear, Raoul?" he asked, the man seemingly lost in whatever he heard. Once Ramirez got close enough, he turned, slowly, his eyes darker than usual. "Their story," he said, simply. Then suddenly the hissing became words, clear and sharp, and he saw his entire group claw at their faces with their hands, as that child voice that was not a child's, that was old and young, sweet and coarse, rang out bright and clear.
Once a peaceful group sought refuge from the ravages of civil war and the tyranny of a new goddess that had ascended their homeland. Their quest for sanctuary led them to a tranquil vale where whispers of ancient forces still lingered among the foliage. For a time, they found solace in this newfound haven, until fate intervened in the form of their king, bearing the solemn burden of a fallen soldier's corpse. Despite their pleas for mercy, bargaining to preserve their sanctuary in exchange for laying the fallen to rest, their entreaties fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the fervor of the king's devotion to his newfound deity. In his cruelty, the king decreed that they erect a necropolis to honor the fallen, only to conscript them into labor once the task was complete. Forced to construct catacombs beneath a fortress near a vast lake, they toiled tirelessly, delving ever deeper into the earth's embrace. Then came the day when the king's forces departed, sealing the catacombs behind them, condemning the inhabitants to a bleak existence in the depths of darkness. Some endured for weeks, clinging to dwindling hope amid the oppressive shadows, but ultimately succumbed to the cruel embrace of hunger and despair. Thousands who had fled their homeland seeking refuge met their end in obscurity, their plight a harrowing testament to the depths of suffering endured by the Ancorians. Now, a lord by the name of Levwyn Lakeheart, an emissary of the king, has arrived to conscript them into a forced conflict against their will. Bound by duty, they are compelled to heed his call, their souls weighed down by the burden of obedience, as they are coerced into perpetrating acts of violence against their fellow beings.
Ramirez opened his eyes to Maria's face above his, her cool, dry hands on his face. She moved back as soon as his eyes were fully open, and he groaned, sitting up to survey his surroundings. Most of the group was still on the ground, either slowly waking or still out. Finea and Telekor, the only ones on their feet and moving within the edge of the light, scouting out the area. His gaze returned to Maria, who crouched next to him. She pulled a water skin from her belt and handed it to him. "Drink." The tone was firm, and he slowly raised it to his lips, swallowing several mouthfuls before returning it when she nodded, satisfied. "Sit still. You hit your head when you went down," she told him, and reached for his face. It was then he felt the warm wetness clinging to his temple. Maria cleaned the wound with sure deft fingers. "It will leave a scar, but nothing more, thankfully," she told him, wiping her hands on her skirt, and he nodded. "Thank you." She smiled back briefly before moving on. The corpses they sometimes passed, not yet alive and strewn about like the seeds on a field, always seemed to flash familiar faces at them. He saw Evelyn and Neon. He heard Aja cry out for her sisters, and saw almost everyone in the group fall to their knees at some point before they were pulled to their feet, soothed by words or touch or silence. Ramirez ran out of comforting words eventually, and chose to instead heave them back on their feet, urging them to keep moving. In a clammy alcove in the darkness of the necropolis, they made something like a camp. Sleep was an uneasy thing down here, barely making a dent in their fatigue, and their dreams vivid and horrid. Ramirez took a seat at the edge, leaning against the damp wall. He felt aged beyond his years, his power trickling out, draining like a leaky cup. His eyes roamed over the party. Aja and Leander on either side of Inaya, curled up like puppies in a pile. Nezra talking quietly with Deni, Kilian, Raoul, Mireia and Lambert, her words of comfort he could feel without hearing them. Diop, Alanish and Harold were sitting next to each in comfortable silence. Aximand and Kur close by, the five of them passing a water skin between them, as well as the rations Wanda had prepared for them, the food offering a small comfort. Umar was looking through his supplies, jumping at every sound and shadow. Talakor seemed to have drifted into a restless sleep alongside Ruvan and Sarafina, while Petrus, Chagall, Finea and Maron were sharing quiet stories. There was movement next to him, and he looked up to find Kaela sliding down the wall to sit beside him, her face smeared with gore, but her blue paint surprisingly intact. The white of a bandage peeked above her collar. "Does sleep elude you?" he asked her, and she flinched before nodding, fumbling with the water skin, and he took it from her hands, opening it with effort. "Someone needs to watch the peacock while he rests," she teased, and he laughed softly. "I'm glad you came here. Thank you, it means a lot." She didn't answer him, instead lifting the water skin to her mouth and tipping back before offering it to him. "It's just water," she said, "but it's better than nothing." He laughed roughly, reaching inside his jacket for his hip flask. "A drink and some conversation might be preferable to sleep," he offered, and she nodded, taking a swing of the flask, and so they did, talking quietly, the flask passing back and forth between them as they kept vigil. One by one, the people around them drifted off to sleep, restless and full of nightmares. A few hours later, when the first member of their party began to stir, Ramirez capped his bottle. Kaela and him exchanged a look before both getting to their feet, ready for another day of unrelentless wandering in the dark. The noise that escaped Kilian was not human, not even animalistic. It was a sound of deep hunger and seething rage. His eyes rolled back in their sockets, the whites shining, and then he was lunging for Aja. The scorpion darted back with a hiss and a curse, her hand reaching for her near-empty quiver, but not fast enough. Kilian's sword came within an inch of her throat, and Ramirez felt the ice-cold rage block out all thoughts and the threat towards her. His sister in everything but blood. He moved without thinking, striking to kill, nothing in his head but that clear, honed rage. A knife flew past his shoulder, embedding itself through the middle of Killian's hand and nailing it to the wall. Killian screamed again, pain edging the noise into an unbearable sound. Ramirez turned to the flash of red behind him, watching Inaya's eyes darken with rage, already twirling another knife in her hand. Ovan's sharp intake of breath preceded his own throw, his knife nailing Killian's other hand, and then Eisermann was rushing in, height and strength enough to pin a thrashing Killian against the wall. The two men strained against each other, but he didn't have to hold him for long. Diop stepped closer, his long fingers reaching out to close around Killian's throat. With an unnervingly kind smile, Diop leaned in. A flare of magic, and then Killian was sputtering water. It was pungent and green, like a long-forgotten pond where no life could thrive, spilling from his mouth. He hacked and carved, threads half sputtered between mouthfuls of the stinking, rotten water. Finally he lunged forward, and then stilled, his body becoming slack and his eyes returning to normal. Inaya stalked over, pulling her knife free from his hand. "Fool me once," she told Killian sharply before stepping aside, as Maria and Nezra came rushing in, healers' hands ready to soothe and help as much as possible. Ramirez looked to Inaya, who was wiping down her blade, and she looked up sharply, feeling his eyes on her. "I'm sorry." The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, and Inaya's gaze narrowed, her mouth tightening in displeasure. "For what? For dragging us down here?" "For asking you to risk your life, to risk theirs." He gestured towards the scorpions, and his voice quieted. "Your family." Inaya huffed in exasperation. "You should. It was an idiotic decision to come here." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone was different, softer. "You are as well, you know." She looked away as if she could not speak the words and look at him at the same time. "I am not here to make you Archon. I could care less about the title you may wield." She sighed. "But I could not let you dive into this darkness alone." He was about to make a comment about the size of the group, and she snapped, "They do not count. You need your family here with you, Ramirez." She finally looked at him, and he was silenced by the emotion in her face. "I would never let you go through this trial alone. We got each other until death claims us and our ashes fly in the wind." He swallowed thickly, feeling the pressure building in his eyes as they stared at each other, and for a moment something warm settled inside of him, chasing away the cold and gnawing hunger. It became a rhythm afterwards, to pin down whoever succumbed to the spirits lurking down here, holding them until one of the mages could get their hands on them, cleansing out the foulness. Leander had presented a real problem, nimble-footed and dancing out of range, spear twirling in front of him. It had taken a coordinated effort from Ramirez himself, letting Leander catch him in the shoulder with his spear, so that he could grapple him, and then Kur take his legs out from underneath him to take the scorpion down. Once Serafina had finished the cleansing, driven out the rotten spirit and leaving only his true soul, Leander sat up, shaking his head as if to rattle his thoughts back in place, and Ramirez offered him a hand up. "It's been a long time since I've had to bleed to take a man down," he told Leander, who grinned back weakly. "We could go in the Haraf once we are back. Let you have a fair chance," he offered, and Ramirez shook his head. "I'd rather you fight for me than against me," he told the scorpion, hauling him back onto his feet. Umar groaned as he held up his bag, the threads fraying, mold covering the beautiful silk as it fell apart in his hands. He threw it to the ground and then winced as several somethings spilled out. Ramirez preferred not to know in detail. Leather, food, cloth, everything seemed to decay more rapidly down here. Even their bones seemed to begin creaking, feeling older and acting like nothing before. Ramirez could feel their hopelessness weighing them down, drowning them quicker than the darkness. They stopped for a short break, the trek seemingly unending, and he watched them with a worry curling like a heavy serpent in the pit of his stomach. As long as you breathe, there's hope. The voice was gentle but firm, and Ramirez did not need to turn in order to know who stood by his side. That presence, warm and soothing, even in this damp and gruesome place. Beautiful words, Nezra, but I am just one man, he told her, his voice rough. His water skin had run empty this morning, the leather so far beyond repair that they had not tried to carry it, simply abandoning it in a corner somewhere. One man can carry a lot, she told him. The hope and trust of a people, the light that will guide them home. All of us have faltered down here, Ramirez, and you have been there every single time to guide us back on our feet. We follow you not just for the love of our realm and fear of what lurks, but because we have chosen you and trusted in the way you pave. Something lit in her eyes, something that settled over him and soothed that ache in his body. Her hand came to rest on his arm, and the warmth seeped into his skin. He almost leaned into the touch. Surveying the group in front of them, the people he could not have done this without, the people that were only a fraction of the lives now balanced in his hands. He closed his eyes for a second, basking in the presence of the woman beside him, breathing easily for the first time since they left daylight behind. When he once again opened his eyes, his breathing was steady, and hope had drowned out the dread. Looking around, he realized that this was what they had to become to each other, that even in this darkness there were little lights. It was Ruvan and Leander singing quietly together, the rest of them listening, some with quiet tears streaming down their faces. It was Seraphina's little flashes of elemental magic, beautiful and strange. It was the spots of laughter, the wicked grins that refused to dim completely. It was the hands offered to get back on one's feet, or the last piece of bread shared equally or unequally in favor of someone needing it more. It was the quiet stories of homelands and long ago adventures shared between all of them. And as they delved deeper into the unknown, a palpable energy began to envelop the party. It was as though the very essence of their shared journey was weaving itself into a protective cloak, binding them together in a bond that transcended mere camaraderie. Each step forward seemed to draw them closer, not just to their destination but to each other, forging connections that would endure far beyond the reaches of their mission. Tunnel of Blood. It had been days, nearly a week of wandering, of scamping resources, of having the mages conjure up water, clearing it for drinking in order for them not to die from thirst. His heart quickened with worry every time someone went ahead to scout, waiting for them to return. It was Finea who had run ahead on this day, and she came rushing back to them, breathing hard. "Straight ahead," she managed to get out, panting. "There's only one way forward, but it is through the heart of this forsaken place." Ramirez's resolve was a hard shield around him as he straightened and looked at his group, meeting their eyes one by one. His gaze returned to Finea, and it was to her he spoke. "Let's give them hell." Her answering smile was nothing but wicked. As they moved, the tunnel widened, and with that the sound hit them like a blow. 1,000 boots stomping, hundreds of mouths snarling and growling, filling the tunnel and twisting their gut with worry. With a collective breath, they turned the corner, and immediately the fight was upon them. There was no time to think or breathe. Every move was an instinct, cutting, slicing, dodging. Behind him the group pushed forward. He watched an undead lunge for Aja before being cleaved in two by Killian. Magic flared brightly around them, and his allies were a lethal force, arrows shooting, knives twirling, swords and spears raised, to face the fate ahead of them. They pushed forward, bleeding for each meter gained, the foes crashing against them like waves upon the sand, ceaseless and unending. Within him, something tugged at his focus, like a harp string being plucked, a single malicious note released into the ether. His gaze moved wildly, searching for the source, and he did not falter when his gaze settled upon it, upon that lone figure standing atop a pile of dead bodies. Levwin. It came out like a snarl, with all the anger that he had been carrying since he had watched Levwin put his sword through Vincent's heart. But the moment of distraction nearly cost him. The jaws snapping for him came too close, way too close, his sword caught between their bodies. Everybody was occupied with their own fight, so it was with a deafening roar that Ramirez pulled back and then punched his head through the skull of the undead, the rotten skin parting like wet paper, but the bone underneath was hard, and his knuckles split open at the contact, the splinters of bone boring into his skin. He could feel the warm wetness of blood sliding down his arm, and he lifted his hand, blood dripping from the wounds, from the finger that he pointed at Levwin. A death promise. His hand didn't tremble as he pointed, and even Levwin seemed to halt, as if knowing that finger meant that his end was suddenly determined. He didn't blink as he stared down Levwin, bloodlust simmering in his veins, boiling his blood. He was ready to charge ahead, to abandon everything for a shot at vengeance. There was a sea of bodies between him and the pile, so vast a number he wasn't sure to even reach it. A cry pierced the air, pain lacing the sound, and Ramirez snapped back, his eyes turning to his people around him, to their blood wetting the floor and the never-ending wave of darkness crashing against them. Ramirez felt the world cleave in two, a singular line being drawn as two paths revealed themselves before him. One of vengeance, of bloodshed, one where not everyone he brought walked away from this place. Or one of protection, of sacrifice, not measured in blood but in will, in pushing back his own desires for the good of a realm. Ramirez's eyes scanned the darkness, the desperate faces of his comrades, blood spilling from between fingers clutched over a wound, from the noses of the mages paying the price for emptying the magic so thoroughly. But still, weapons kept moving, still undeads went down, but they could not continue. They had faced the darkness and survived, and it would be enough for now. So Ramirez gritted his teeth and turned again to Levwin, and the wind carried his voice even above the clang of battle and the screams of the undead. The roses will claim their vengeance owed from you. Not today, but someday. Your days are numbered and your power limited. Ramirez looked over his shoulder at the group straining to hold back the army clawing at them. This way, he bellowed, sword raised to the sky in defiance. The road to the archway was paved with blood and pain, fighting on all fronts as they moved through, the dark cool gaze of Levwin upon them. Ramirez finally reached the wall, and he turned around, gripping Nezra harshly by the arm and yanking her through the entrance, then shoving Mireia in after her. Some of his party went willingly, some he shoved in, not caring that they protested. He turned to see who was still out in the fray, and he was just in time to watch the undead lunging for Petrus. Blood sprayed from the gash across his thigh, and he stumbled back, but Chagall was there immediately, a lethal force cutting down any foe that reached for the injured warrior. Lambert dragged Petrus to safety, and then it was just Umar and Chagall outside. The alchemist sprayed with the blood of his comrades, and that seemed to undo him. "I am tired of you fuckers!" the alchemist bellowed, a thread finally snapping, and his hands dug into his pockets, into bags and hidden places to pull out vials. Vials he threw with impressive accuracy. Vials that exploded on impact, smoke and acid and fire burning through bones and flesh, leaving the undead shrieking in pain and terror. Ramirez moved into the tunnels, hands raised and vines ready to strike as soon as everybody was in sight. "Umar!" he called out, and then the alchemist turned sharply, running as fast as possible to get to them. He slid into the tunnel and Ramirez pulled the roots tight, closing the horror off. Silence fell as they stood in the corridor. Ramirez was gulping down breath after breath, fury and rage filling his body as his blood slid down his arm, dripping from the finger he had pointed at Lakeheart and onto the mud on the floor. He lifted his gaze, surveying the friends and family he had brought with him, the injured leaning against each other, healers already working with their limited resources, but all of them alive, all of them breathing. He gritted his teeth, his nails digging into the palm of his hand. He would protect these people. No matter what, he would not fail. He would not fail the trust they had put in him. It was the change in light he noticed first, the way it cast a warm golden glow over their faces, eyes sparkling in the light, and when he looked up, a glowing vine, thorns of gold and roses blooming crystal clear, was descending from the ceiling towards him. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his hand slowly raising to touch the wine. A sharp intake went through the group gathered in a near-perfect circle, all eyes upon him, upon this last part of his trial. Not a trial of battle, but a much more quiet strength, of hope, of love and loyalty. A trial for him to face the deepest darkness his realm had to offer, to face both it and himself, and come out ready to bear the responsibility that now seemed to call his name. The vine wrapped gently around his hand. The biggest bloom settled into his palm. For a moment, the world was still. Nothing was moving. Then the vine tightened, thorns tearing through his skin, ruby droplets appearing, staining the flowers crimson. Ramirez winced but did not move. He would bleed for this. There was nothing he would not give for this realm, for its people, and as that first droplet of blood ran down his arm, dripping onto the floor, a word went through him. Archon, it rang out, first through him and then echoing through the room, loud and clear, a call and an answer all together, and as the wine dissipated, sinking into his skin, as that power rumbled through him, as he heard the voice of his people, of his land, clearer than ever before, their singing, their crying, their joy and sorrow, he had never felt more at peace. Light exploded through the tunnel as thousands of amber stones embedded in the walls lit up, and Ramirez started walking, instinctively knowing the way home. Way above them, Neom clutched at her chest, feeling the other half of that frayed bond inside her becoming whole, and she knew, without a doubt, that the Realm of Roses had an Archon once more. Fresh air greeted them once the tunnel came to an end, breaking above ground, and it tasted like sweet honeyed wine. They gulped it down as such. Ramirez turned to the group. Some of us will go on to meet Neom, and some of us need to return home to the realm, he told them, his eyes on the healers and the injured, who nodded in agreement, separating into their own group. Chagall, Maria, Nesra, Alanish, Petrus and Finea, duty and rest both beckoning them home. Ramirez stepped forward and gripped Chagall's arm, squeezing it tightly. Bring them home safely and keep our defenses ready, he told him firmly, nodding at the small group behind the man, Petrus hanging between Maria and Nesra, keeping weight off his injured leg. Finea offered him a crooked smile, patting the bow slung over her shoulder in reassurance. Chagall nodded firmly. Yes, my Archon. And Ramirez's chest tightened at that word, that title, that burden now upon him. This first time hearing it out loud, pride and joy shone in Chagall's face, despite the gore and blood caking it. Ramirez strode over to Nesra, Maria, Finea, Alanish and Petrus, looking over each of them in turn. I have no words for my gratitude towards each of you, but know that it is everlasting." A faint shimmer of tears shone in Miria's eyes as she nodded, her hands tightening its grip on Petrus's arm. Ramirez stepped back, watching them until they disappeared from his sight. Then he turned to the rest of the group, weary but joyful. He grinned broadly. "Let's all, as we wouldn't want to arrive late to the festivities." Aja and Leander let out a whooping cheer, somehow finding the energy to dart on ahead. Talakor right on their heels. Inaya shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. Harold's grin was bright as the noon sun. "You are incorrigible, Ramirez." There was laughter from Kaela and Umar at the words. Sarafina shook her head slightly and smiled, and Diop came up to walk next to him, patting his back. "This was fun. Let's not do it again for a while," the face said brightly. Eisermann fell into step on Ramirez's other side. "Why not? It's been a perfect vacation." His tone was wry and humor glinted in his eyes. "Sure," Raoul drawled. "I just need a fucking drink before we repeat this mess." "Or 10, Ruvan added, idling twirling a plate between his fingers as they walked. "I'm sure the Caverns will offer plenty at the celebrations of the new Archon," Hua offered with a smile. Lambert rubbed at his forehead, sighing. Him, Killian and Maron made up a steadying, unyielding wall behind them, but Ramirez didn't look back. He didn't need to. His back was guarded and his gaze was only forward, only on the future, and the roses waiting for them to come home. Here ends this podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again to our wonderful community for making this world exciting and vibrant. Many thanks to all the helpers who lend a hand wherever they are needed. We are now starting work on the plotcast for the most important events of the JDS. We also already have some ideas for further plotcasts, for example some that focus on our fiefdoms and their culture and special features. If you are interested and want to help, please contact us. See you next time. Time out.